Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. The first thing that I heard about Pedro Páramo was a comment from a college professor who spoiled the entire story for the class. After that, I had to read it for a course on the literature of the Mexican Revolution, just like Los de Abajo that I told you about a few weeks ago. And then after that, I had to read it again for a course on the Latin American novella that was one of the most amazing experiences that I had in college. So this is the copy that I used both of those times. It's in Spanish and it brings together Pedro Páramo and El Llano en Llamas. But anyway, earlier this year, I found out that there had been a new translation into English that had just been published, and this is it right here. So I decided to finally experience Pedro Páramo in English, because I always had that question. I was like, this is a magnificent novella, but I wonder what it sounds like to speakers of English. So I decided to experience that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Pedro Páramo, looking at some specific concepts regarding this novella. We're going to talk about the translation, and we are also going to look at the adaptation, which is a Mexican film from 1967. First of all, let me give you a very quick overview of the novella, just in case it is necessary. So Pedro Páramo takes place against the backdrop of the Mexican Revolution. And this is a story of Juan Preciado, who goes back to the town of Comala right after his mother's death, looking for his father, who was named Pedro Páramo. Comala is a very strange place full of very strange people who tell their stories. There's a very nice dimension of storytelling to this novella. And little by little, Juan Preciado begins to hear and to learn about Pedro Páramo until the story of Pedro Páramo basically takes over the narrative. In the last third of the story, so when you come towards the end of this novella, there's a character named Susana San Juan who becomes prominent. She is a woman who had been married to Pedro Páramo. And another important character, recurring character that we should mention is the priest, Father Renteria. So that is a quick overview of the plot, or what happens, the situation, and the characters for you. The first thing that I wanted to mention is the importance of name symbolism here. I am sure you have heard about the importance of the name Pedro Páramo, right? So Pedro, we have Peter, which means stone or rock, and Páramo means in Spanish desert or a barren place. Then there's also the name of Juan Preciado. When you hear Juan, John, right, it's a very common name, so it's kind of like saying an everyman type of person. And Preciado in Spanish means valued. Preciado as in price, somebody who's priced. And you see the irony right there. This is a guy who is not really valued. He didn't even know who his father was. Then we have Susana San Juan. Okay, so Susana is a Hebrew name. It means lily of the valley. And it also makes me think of the biblical story of Susanna. This is a story that you can find only in the Catholic Bible. So if you go to the book of Daniel, chapter 13, that's where you can find the story of Susanna, who is a woman, a young woman, who is taken advantage of by two older men. So if you have read Pedro Páramo, keep that in mind, because I think it's important to the story. And by the way, a little bit of trivia here. You can also find the story of Susanna in the 1001 Nights. So I thought that was very interesting. Susanna, San Juan. Okay, San Juan, Saint John, the disciple that was close to Christ. And then we also have to mention Father Renteria, Renteria as in rentar or to rent, suggesting that this is a man who can be bought off. So notice how charged these names are that we find in the novella. Now we have to talk about structure. Okay, if you talk about Pedro Páramo, the novella, you have to address the issue of structure, because as you may know, Pedro Páramo is often referred to as a text that is very difficult to read, and that has to do primarily with the structure, if you ask me, because the novella begins linearly enough. You're going to be okay if you haven't read it, right? In the first 2 pages, maybe first 3 pages, you're not going to have any problems. It's linear enough. But then after that, we begin to go back and forth in time. Because for one, we are alternating between the story of Juan Preciado and the story of Pedro Páramo. But even when the story of Pedro Páramo takes over and we're hearing primarily about him, the events are not presented to us in chronological order. So that's why the structure can be a little bit complicated. This novella follows the logic of memory, The Logic of Dreams, or maybe Nightmares. And each brief chapter that you find, the chapters are very, very short, is a piece of a puzzle. Okay, I'm sure you have heard that before. It's a very common analogy, but I think it works in this case. If it didn't, I wouldn't use it. So yes, all of those are pieces of the puzzle that we have to keep together. So what's the point? What's the key to reading Pedro Paramo? I would say it's just keep reading. Okay, keep reading, and then when you're done, reread it. Okay, that's probably the best way to get the best results. It's a very brief text. We're talking about 100 pages, 120 pages. So it's really not a problem to reread if you really want to get the most out of Pedro Paramo. We're going to talk a little bit about genre, okay, because there's a very big and generalized misconception about Pedro Paramo, and this is it. Most people refer to it as a novel when it is in fact a novella. You had probably expected that from me, and I had already said that it was a novella, so that doesn't really come as a surprise. But what makes it a novella? That's a valid question here. Not just the number of pages. Okay, the novella has something to do with the number of pages, of course, but that's not the whole issue. The issue of whether something is a novel, a novella, or a short story, if you ask me, is primarily an issue of structure. The novella has a repetitive structure, okay? It has a spiral structure that revolves around the re-examination of a situation. So in other words, there's no plot per se. And what is the situation in the case of Pedro Paramo? There are many ways that you can answer this question, but I think that if you're looking for one way to put it that I think encompasses the most, I would say that the situation that is presented to us here in a recurring manner and re-examined is the state of Comala after Pedro Paramo crosses his hands, as he famously put it. I think that's basically the best way to describe what this novella presents to us in that recurring or spiral fashion. And another feature that you often find in the novella is the presence of a double story. And you definitely have that here. You have the story of Juan Preciado, and at the same time, superimposed with that, the story of Pedro Paramo. You know what novella, famous novella, I thought of as I was rereading Pedro Paramo? Heart of Darkness. Okay? In Heart of Darkness, you also have that double story. It's the story of Marlowe, but it is also the story of Kurtz. And by the way, there are many points of contact between Heart of Darkness and Pedro Paramo, I think. So, topic for maybe another video or another time, you know, but I would invite you to explore that if you want to read those two novellas back to back. So that was genre. Okay, what about subgenre or mode or whatever we want to call it? Pedro Paramo is a horror story. Okay, it is also a love story. You can definitely read it like that, but it is also a dictator story. I'm not going to say a dictator novel because it's not a novel. It's a dictator novella, if we were going to call it that. So Pedro Paramo, the man, is described as un rencor vivo. That's the famous description of him. It was translated into English as a resentment or a bitterness incarnate, depending on what translation you look at. So this guy, Pedro Paramo, is just the archetype of the patriarch, or the caudillo, or the cacique, because the town of Comala depends on him completely. As you may know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was a big fan of Pedro Paramo, and as a matter of fact, if you look at the new translation, it comes with a foreword by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And this time, as I was rereading Pedro Paramo in English, I noticed that there is a really, really close connection between Pedro Paramo and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's masterpiece, if you ask me, The Autumn of the Patriarch. Pedro Paramo is also about the solitude of power. That is how Gabriel Garcia Marquez describes The Autumn of the Patriarch, and you could apply the same description to the novella by Juan Rulfo. So the main difference, what is it? I would say that Rulfo doesn't really go in depth into the psychology of the dictator or the caudillo. Pedro Paramo, the way that I look at it, is halfway between, on the one hand, The Autumn of the Patriarch, and on the other hand, Miguel Ángel Asturias's Mr. President, or El Señor Presidente. So if you look at the president, let's start with him. In Asturias's novel, he is a tyrant. He is a merciless figure who has the power of a myth. He demands blood and sacrifice. So that's all that you have. Then on the other hand, if you look at the patriarch, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's character, he's also merciless, and he really is an awful, brutal figure. But at the same time, this is a guy who has suffered. He is a pathetic figure. And as readers, we can even come to understand this awful character of the patriarch. And then, if you ask me, right, you have Pedro Páramo right there in the middle. He is also a man who has suffered. But if you ask me, I don't think that his suffering really justifies the evil that he causes to Comala, to his own people. There are ways to explain that, to explain his suffering and the way he reacts, but I think it's still not enough. And I think that Pedro Páramo, because of that, is more of an enigma. When you look at the patriarch, we get a lot of information in Garcia Marquez's novel about him. When you look at the president in Miguel Ángel Asturias' novel, he's a myth. So in a way you could say that there's really no way to understand a myth. You can just accept it. Pedro Páramo is much more ambiguous. Why is that? One of the reasons is that that has to do precisely with the nature of the novella as a genre, because it's a genre that really thrives on suggestion. So things are suggested here. That's why the text is so brief, and we have to fill in those gaps. I wanted to add a note here in this video about what it's like to reread Pedro Páramo. This is my third time reading it, as I said before, 2 times in Spanish and then this time in English. And you're going to notice that, like many other novellas, Pedro Páramo relies on a revelation. I'm thinking of novellas like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like The Invention of Morel. So you have that revelation. It doesn't happen in the typical place as you would find it maybe in a short story or a novel, where you have that Freytag's pyramid and it happens right there close to the climax, and then you have the ending of the story. In this case, it happens in a different place. But a difficult task for a writer who is working with a text that relies on a revelation is making that text rereadable. Once you know that revelation, why would you reread it, right? So how do you do this? How do you make a text that relies on a revelation rereadable? There are many ways to do that, okay? But I think one of the best ways to do it, and one of the most, effective when it comes to readers and how they perceive your text, is through the use of irony. And that is definitely present here in Pedro Páramo. So Pedro Páramo is a delight to read, of course, but it is also a delight to reread. And that is something that is rare. It's very difficult to find that. But here's the thing. As you reread the novella, you're going to notice, or you're going to be more aware of the clues that Rulfo is providing regarding that revelation that comes at some point in the novella. So you really become, when you reread Pedro Páramo, fully aware of how masterful this novella is, because the clues are present there from the very beginning. It's very similar to the experience of rewatching Psycho, Hitchcock's Psycho, of course. We're going to talk a little bit more about that because there is another connection, believe it or not. So I also wanted to tell you about the new translation, okay, which is the one that I read. This is the 3rd translation of Pedro Páramo into English, and it was done by Douglas J. Weatherford. He has a note on how he approached translation, and he mentions many very good points, but I wanted to focus on 2 points that kind of guided his task of translation. The first one that I thought was amazing was how Weatherford decided to remain faithful to the punctuation marks that Rulfo uses in order to signal dialogue. And this is very interesting. He uses at least 3 types of different punctuation marks to tell you this is dialogue. And what I wanted to say is this. I want to be brief about this. Those are very important. Okay, so if you're reading Pedro Páramo for the first time or even rereading it, pay attention to those different punctuation marks that he uses, because they are really part of the story and how the story works. And the second point, which is somewhat related, Weatherford also decided to be faithful to the use of the subjunctive when he did his translation. As you know, the subjunctive in English is not very common. It's not used very much. But in Spanish, we use it all the time. And in this novella in particular, you find it all over the place. So it's very important to pay attention to those uses of the subjunctive and to also be aware of the fact that it just gives the story a very hypothetical, a very vague, right? And it goes towards making it an eerie story when you read it and when you realize in what parts he's using that subjunctive mode. There is nothing like the original, okay? That's a given. That goes without saying. But when you take that into consideration, then I would say that the translation by Weatherford is really brilliant. There were a couple of moments when I thought, oh, here something is lost. I'm going to give you a quick example, but that happens all the time. As I said, that's a given. For example, on the first page, when in the first little chapter here, Juan Preciado says, hasta que ahora pronto comencé a llenarme de sueños, a darle vuelo a las ilusiones. And then when you look at the English translation of that part, it says, until recently when I began to imagine all kinds of possibilities and allowed my fantasies to run free. So I really liked, something that struck me the first time that I read this text was that empecé a llenarme de sueños, which literally means I began to become filled with dreams. And that becomes in the translation, I began to imagine all kinds of possibilities. Is that a valid way to translate it? Absolutely. But you notice what I'm saying. There's that idea of dreams that is lost in this case, because possibilities can also be dreams. So I just wanted to give you a quick example, but I do want to say I really enjoyed this English translation. I enjoyed it just as much as I did reading Pedro Páramo in Spanish many years ago. Now let's talk about the film adaptation, okay? And before we go into the details of the actual film, let's look at a couple of difficulties that you might find when you want to adapt a text like this one. One difficulty, obviously, the structure, right? It has a complex structure. Doesn't mean that you cannot do it. You could translate that structure into cinematic language and it could go very well, but it's definitely a difficulty. And the other difficulty is the fact that the novella as a genre does not really rely on plot. So those are two things that you have to consider if you want to adapt Pedro Páramo. However, by the same token, you also have some advantages with this text, and I'm going to mention the most important one for me. That is the fact that this is an atmospheric text. It's an atmospheric novella. And if you can do that well, if you can do that right in film, it really can yield amazing results. So those are some considerations prior to watching the movie that I had. So the film is by a Spanish filmmaker by the name of Carlos Bello, and it was released in 1967. It's a Mexican film, of course, and you know who collaborated with the writing of the script? He was actually the first name that appears there. Carlos Fuentes. Okay, so amazing job he did with the script. Carlos Fuentes, the director of the film and the producer, wrote the script, but I believe that Carlos Fuentes was the one who was primarily responsible for it. Now, the first thing that grabbed my attention about the film is that they added an epigraph at the beginning, right after the titles, right before the story begins. And it's an epigraph from La vida es sueño, or Life is a Dream, which I happen to have right here because I was actually just thinking about rereading that and reading the English translation so that I could do a video on it and share my thoughts on it with you. So look at that. I mean, that's what I mean when I say that I don't really choose the books that I read, but the books choose me. So let me read you the epigraph that they put there at the beginning of the movie. I'm going to use the English translation. I say to you, false shadows, go. My deadened senses know your schemes, to feign a body and a voice, when voice and body both are shams. I am disabused of all I thought, and know now life is but a dream. So you can consider that in the context of Pedro Páramo. I think it's a really good epigraph to add right there. The film, I think, really does a very good job of conveying the mood of the novella, and I think this is done mostly through the use of setting. Okay, the setting, what you see in this movie is Comala. Okay, it's really Comala, and I mean that both in a local way and a universal way, because there are Comalas all over Latin America. Okay, this is a place that is very local, but it is also universal. So what we are seeing here, what we are dealing with Comala, is the archetype of the Latin American town, the small town where everybody knows each other. And we have a saying in Spanish that goes, Pueblo chico, infierno grande, which means small town, big hell, okay? And that really, you can see that in Comala and in Pedro Páramo for sure. I was very well impressed by the acting. I think that everybody in this film did a very good job, but I wanted to mention that Pedro Páramo is played by an American actor. His name is John Gavin, and I am pretty sure that you know him. He was in many films, but most people who watch this movie are going to recognize him as the character Sam Loomis from Hitchcock's Psycho. Okay, he was Marion's boyfriend. Remember that initial scene at that hotel? That is the guy who played Pedro Paramo, and I think he did an excellent job. Okay, I think it was a very, very well done piece of acting. Is he Pedro Paramo? Listen to this, okay? This is what I think. No one on earth is Pedro Paramo. Okay, so once you accept that, I think that John Gavin did a really excellent job as this character. And I mean, playing Pedro Paramo is something, okay? If you're an actor, no matter how good you are, it is not an easy task. So we have to keep that in mind. And just like Psycho, you know, this is another connection that I was thinking about when I was watching the film and thinking about the novella. Pedro Paramo is a text that plays with us as readers and as film watchers in this case also, because at the beginning we think that Juan is the protagonist of the story, right? But then we begin to remove some layers there and we realize that things are much more complex than we realized initially, which is very similar to what happens in Psycho. And that's all that I'm going to say, because I don't want to spoil any of these stories for you. Now let's look at the differences between the novella and the film, okay, because there are always differences. I think that one of the main things that I noticed when I was watching the film was that this film fills in a lot of the gaps. Okay, in the novella there are gaps, there are jumps. The novella suggests, it doesn't really spell things out for you. So there are places where the action and some things are missing. The movie fills out some of those places. Quick example, we see the celebration of Pedro Paramo's wedding. We don't really have that in the novella. In the novella, he decides to get married, and next thing you know, he's married, right? So you see the celebration here. So you know what I mean? They added some things to those gaps that you find in the story. And also, something is added to that scene. Remember when Susana is lowered into the pit? Don't ask me why, but that was the one scene that stood out to me the first time that I read this novel. I have no idea why. So anyway, in the movie they added something to that part right there where she's down there in the pit. What they added is really faithful to the novella if you think about it, but it just makes things more explicit. So if you watch the film, you're going to see what I mean when I say that. Now regarding the ending, okay, let's talk a little bit about that without revealing anything. The ending, we have two endings here, first of all, right? Because we have Juan Preciado's story and then Pedro Paramo's story. So the ending of Juan Preciado's story happens in the movie much closer to the end. They didn't put it in the midpoint, which is where you can find it in the novella. And then the ending of the whole story, right? The very last 3 or 4 minutes of the film, the last scene, is made much more dramatic and much more obvious in the film, and maybe they took a little bit of a poetic license right there, so I'll let you explore that. In other words, if we come to the bottom line regarding the film adaptation, what happened here is that the movie is much more traditional and makes everything much more explicit, and as a result also easier to follow. But I think that's to be expected when you're dealing with films. If you take into consideration that, generally speaking, film audiences are quite traditional, are quite conservative even, generally speaking, much more so than readers, I believe. So that's something there that changes when you go from the page to the screen. But I'm going to say it is still a very daring film, and just the task of adapting Pedro Paramo into film is not an easy one. So you have to commend them for doing that, right? I, for my part, you know, now that I have seen the 1967 adaptation, I can't wait to see what Netflix does with Pedro Paramo. You know how it is. They are adapting everything. The other day, my girlfriend showed me a trailer for 100 Years of Solitude. So, I mean, I don't know what comes next. The posthumous memoirs of Bras Cubas or something. So I'm really looking forward. I'm going to check them out just to see what they do with these stories. So that is definitely something to look forward to. And if I feel it's worth it, I'm going to add my 2 cents on that if I get the chance to watch it. Bottom line, please read Pedro Paramo if you haven't read it already. Okay, this is Latin American fiction at its best before critics began to place the magical realism label on everything. So that's something that is really another reason for us to read this novella. And you know what? There is a Borges connection. Okay, I saved the best for last. Or not, depending on how we look at it. Because here's the thing. Borges included Pedro Paramo as part of his Biblioteca Personal. So you know those books that he thought were the best books that he had ever read? Pedro Páramo is one of them. If you look at his prologue, though, he doesn't really say much about it. I was looking at, okay, I want to read what Borges wrote about it so that maybe I can share that with you. Turns out there's not really much. There's a description, very brief, here in the back cover of the book that says it is one of the best novels in Hispanic literature and in literature as a whole. But there's not really much that Borges adds to the discussion in this prologue. And one of the reasons, maybe, is that there's just no need. It's not necessary to say more. And speaking of that, I have already spoken more than I needed to about Pedro Páramo. So I would just say, once again, please read Pedro Páramo. I think you're going to enjoy it. And it's one of those literary experiences that you just have to have. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. I'm always here. Those were my 2 cents on Pedro Páramo, the novella by Juan Rulfo, the translation by Douglas Weatherford, and the film adaptation by Carlos Velo from 1967. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.